Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third in our second series of webinars from us at Larson-Juhl. I'm Matt George, for those of you who haven't attended the webinars before, either live or if you're watching afterwards. Thanks for joining, those of you who are on live, and also thanks to anybody who's watching this afterwards when we put the webinars up on our website. I have spoken to quite a number of you over the last few days, and I know that you're busy getting ready for restart and reopening the businesses. I know that the government did delay that for non-essential businesses until the 15th of June, but you know, the process of starting to get ready doesn't just begin the night before. So I know that many of you are trading where you can, and many of you are getting ready for that. So you know, we're here to help and support you. Quite a few of you have said that you've really appreciated the ability to be able to watch these webinars in your own time, and I'm glad that you can. So as before, they'll go up on the website, they'll go onto our YouTube channel, for everybody who wants to view them, and we'll put the presentations on there as well, so you've got them as a reference afterwards. So we're into the third of our mini series today around Ready to Restart, and I'm really pleased that I've got Jon Price, who will be joining us very soon to talk to you about some more technical framing masterclass. Just a reminder for everybody who hasn't been on the webinar before about some of the facilities. As I said a couple of days ago, we are trying to make it a little more interactive. It can be difficult with these types of sessions, but we have enabled the chat facility. I can already see there's a little bit of chat going on, so that's great. Happy for you to do that and use that. You can also ask questions, as you have done before. You can ask them via the Q&A app that you've got either on your computer or your phone or wherever you're watching this from. You can also, if you want to, towards the end when we go into Q&A, I'll get Jon back up on the video, and I'll be on there as well. And then if you want to raise your hand and then ask a question live, then I can bring you into the video. You're more than welcome to do that. That's no problem. But equally, if you want to go and send a question through via the app, then do that. We might answer them as we go, or Jon may decide to answer them at the end if he thinks that the question's coming up later on in the presentation. But that is there for you to do that. Okay, we've again, we'll enable you, if you're doing your CPD qualifications, your Guild Certified Framers certificate, to have the certification points, your 2 points for watching the webinar, whether that is live or whether you're watching it after the time. So you'll get some details on that afterwards, be able to provide your responses, and then get a couple of points towards those qualifications that you are working towards. Where we are in terms of the little mini series that we've got about Ready to Restart, we're on the third one. So I was pleased that we had Joe Palmer, who done a great session yesterday all about getting ready to reopen, some real practical advice on there, and support around what you need to do to reopen your business. So we'll get those up on the website towards the end of the week. And then we also had Alice Bryan on Tuesday, who shared with us some of the latest design trends, getting you thinking about different mouldings and mount options around the different seasons that we've got, and trends around sustainability. So that again was a good webinar, some useful information. We've had some good feedback on that, and again, I'll get that put on the website for you to refer back to or to watch if you didn't get to watch it at the time. So what I'm going to do now, without further ado, I will ask Jon to come onto the video, do a little introduction, and then I'll hand over to Jon. Here he is. Hi, Jon.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Matt. So hello, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, that I haven't met before, my name is Jon Price, just in case you can't read your screen. And what I want to talk to you about today is frame design. Before we start, what I'd like you to do is think of a rule or a guideline of framing design. And I'd like you, if you have a pen and paper with you, just to write it down, especially if your memory is like mine. Or if your memory is better, do remember it, and we'll come back to it and we'll talk about it at the end and we'll reflect on that, that guideline. Okay, so while you're writing that down or just thinking up a rule, I'm just going to share my screen with you. Here we go. Great stuff. Okay. So after the last series of Larson-Juhl webinars that we did, one of the requests that we had was for a session on frame design. I have to say, I don't consider myself to be a framing design expert. In fact, I don't believe, to be honest, that my opinion is any more valid than that of anyone else. Especially having had a look at the list of participants today, I think that it should be some of you talking to me. However, I do consciously think about frame design. I spend my time analysing both my own frame designs and the frame designs of other framers, considering what I think works and what doesn't. I'm a strong believer that all professional framers should be able to frame to conservation level. However, from a business point of view, I think design is something that's a much easier sell because it's visual and essentially it sells itself. Because of this, and because I enjoy the creative side of framing, I aim to make my framing a little bit different and for it to stand out. Considering that design is arguably the most important aspect of framing, there isn't actually that much that's written on it. Many of the framing books that I regularly refer to skim over design in a few paragraphs and concentrate instead on practical design techniques. Framing magazine articles, social media posts, and other reference material seem to be either very general in terms of design rules, or they're very specific and they only apply to certain scenarios. Either way, exceptions to these rules can easily be found. And I wonder, what does that tell us? What I want to do in this webinar is to examine some of the things we might think of as framing rules, or framing design rules, I should say. And I want us to think about some of the standard practices and see if those rules and those standard practices hold true. I want to look at frame designs that don't follow standard rules and practices and see whether they work or not. I've got to admit, I don't always expect that you're going to agree with me. And part of that is because my intent is to question our current preconceptions and our ideas. As part of this, we're going to be looking at some different design concepts that I hope will also prove inspirational to some of you. Now, some of the frame designs that you're going to see are mine. Others have been provided by kind permission of Greg Perkins over in the US and by Ian Kenny of Ian Kenny Framing. So let's start off then with one of the rules. I've read on more than one occasion that with double mounts, a strong coloured bottom mount of over 5mm is likely to overwhelm the artwork. And this is true, but only in certain scenarios. Surely it depends on balancing the piece as a whole. Shouldn't the proportions of all the elements of the mount, including the bottom mount, increase in proportion with the size of the artwork? Not always, but in some cases, the answer must be yes. I've also found that on smaller pieces, the dominating effect by the bottom mount can be overcome by increasing the amount of white space around the artwork. In other words, the strong bottom mount is distanced from the artwork. In the picture on the right, this additional white space has been highlighted by the weight of the V-groove. Now, you have to conclude that that being the case, the amount of strong colour bottom mount which should be displayed surely depends on the balance and the proportions of all other aspects of the framing design. Another seemingly obvious rule is that using mount colours that are close to the colours of the artwork, but ones that don't quite match, will distract from the artwork and will look wrong. And to me, again, I say that's a seemingly obvious rule, but in this particular design on the right-hand side, framer Greg Perkins has proved that that's not always the case. Now, Greg confesses that he couldn't find exact mount colors to match the image. And if you look carefully, you'll see that neither the top mount nor the blue mount quite match. He says he tried neutral color mounts, but he wasn't happy with the results. So what Greg's done is he's placed the top mount that matches the least, that gold mount, furthest away from the artwork. Next is the slightly better, but still too light a blue mount, which is separated from the blue in the artwork with a black bottom mount. And that black bottom mount does match. It matches the lady's dress, both in terms of color, but also in terms of its matte texture. And it's that separation of the non-matching colors that mean that they work. Were they straight up against the artwork, we'd see that they were wrong. They weren't quite the right tone. They didn't look right, and it would look strange. As a final point, look closely at the frame, and you'll see that the molding doesn't match either. It doesn't really match any of the colors, but what it does do is it does have touches of blue in it, which emphasize the blue in the picture. And as a whole, the package does work. Now, one rule that does hold true, but is a very general rule, is to say that we should design with mount colors and with frame colors that are as close to the colors of the artwork as possible, and or neutral colors, so colors such as white, cream, black, or gray. In the picture on the right, we see the use of a combination of neutral and matching colors. GCF Advanced, Ian Kenny, has presented the football shirt, well, in my opinion, beautifully. I think that the sky blue of the shirt really stands out against that neutral black mount. And then he's combined that with the gold bottom mount that again picks out the text in the shirt, and finally finished off with a black and a gold molding. So you've got a really nice balance in the piece, mixing neutral mounts and colors from the object. And at the same time, because he's used that black mount, that blue really, really stands out. So looking at that rule, should we use colors that are as close to the colors of the artwork as possible, or neutral colors? We can also think about another concept, and this is a concept from color design and theory, which should be relevant to picture framing. In fact, color theory gives us a number of rules that can be applied, and I'll talk about some of these as we go on. One theory is the use of contrasting colors. In other forms of design, the contrasting colors of a tertiary or 12-part color wheel are regularly used to come up with balanced and harmonious designs. For example, look at the Fanta logo on the right-hand side. Now, I've yet to see an example of frame design where contrasting colors have been used and they work. Just before I go on to the next slide, what I want you to do is have a quick look at that color wheel. And a bit like the blue and the orange of the Fanta logo are opposite each other pretty much in the color wheel. Look also at the yellow and the purple. Now, as I say, I've yet to see designs where a contrasting color to the artwork works. So what I thought it'd be quite fun to do is to go on to Larson-Juhl's US website, where Matt's mentioned before they have a visualization tool. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to come up with a design using contrasting colors. So I've taken this yellow rose and I've found a purple molding. In fact, this is two moldings stacked together to give it a little bit of width. And I've come up with a design using contrasting colors. Now, I could possibly say that I've cheated a little bit. This wasn't my first design. The goldy color around the edge of the molding does obviously match the colors in the rose a little bit more. So I think I haven't used just contrasting colors. But what do you think? I'm interested. Do you think this design works? In fact, send us your answers. We've got the question and answers thing. We've got the comments. Send us your ideas. Tell us whether you think this is a design that works, and tell us whether you think the use of contrasting colors like this could work and does have a place in framing. Personally, the more I look at this design, the more I think they could, but maybe I've just spent a little bit too long sitting in front of my computer screen over the last few days. Now, one thing that I find really impressive is when a framer uses texture in a frame molding, okay, or in texture in a frame molding or a mount, as well as color to match the textures within the artwork or the object. Now, this can be as simple as matching the matte finish of a mount board, or it can be something more definite like the color pattern or the detail of a molding. And this example on the right-hand side, I think is a wonderful example of that. Again, it's a piece by Greg Perkins. Greg's used a monochrome treble mount that brings out the pink in the artwork. And as an interesting point, I think it probably brings out the pink in the artwork more than if he'd used any pink in the mount design itself. But to me, what makes this absolutely stunning is how Greg's chosen a molding that matches the texture of that squiggly pattern in the artwork. And the use of this particular molding, I think, emphasizes that part of the artwork much more so than if a different molding had been used. So it's much more noticeable because of that. Now, getting back to the rules of framing, or the supposed rules, one of the more commonly expressed rules of mount design is that mount colors shouldn't be stronger than the colors of the image. And again, this is generally true, but there can be exceptions. With this pastel on the right, I pulled out 3 colors that were clearly in the artwork. So these included a brown, and I really wanted to use the brown to create some contrast and to pull out the brown in the bark of the trees and in the foreground of the image. But both, or 2 of the colors I pulled out, the dark blue and the brown, were stronger colors than their counterparts in the image. And I'm guessing that common practice would have been to use the light blue as a top mount, and then maybe the darker blue in the mount in whichever order for, the darker blue and the brown in whichever order for the middle and the bottom mounts. I tried it, and as far as I was concerned, it didn't work. So I played around and I came up with this idea, which probably shouldn't work either, and perhaps you think it doesn't. I spaced both the strong colors away from the image, using as little of the brown as possible. So I've probably used 2 mil of that brown that's showing. And I finished off with that softer, more subtle light blue on the inside next to the artwork, cutting it wide to help distance the other mounts. This kind of touches on the stuff that we were talking about before, where we're spacing colors away from the artwork, stronger colors or colors that don't match quite so much. And I don't know about you, but I really like this. I think the frame and the mount really add perspective to the piece. And again, I'm sure that you can pass on your comments and let me know what you think. At least hopefully some of you agree with me. Now, as an additional note, I've broken some of my own rules here, and I've used more than 3 colors in the frame design. It touches on another rule of color theory called color harmony. And one aspect of color harmony says that using too many colors in a design makes it uncomfortable to look at, it lacks harmony, and it becomes slightly chaotic. And I certainly think that using more than 2, maximum 3 colors normally in a design means that it does become unbalanced. Now, we've just said that in general, the mount colors that we use shouldn't be stronger than the colors of the image. So therefore, to me, it's logical to say that the bolder the artwork is, the stronger the colors in your frame design can be. And I don't think there are many pictures that wouldn't be overwhelmed by this particular frame, consisting of 4 different brightly colored moldings of the same profile. I have to say that I think that the bright red bottom mount could be narrower. But what I want you to notice as well about this piece is how the top mount matches the paper. I think it's really important not to forget that any paper that's visible in the artwork is also part of the artwork. Now, I often match paper colors. Part of the reason that I do that is because neutral colors often work well for top mounts. They're less likely to dominate. A stronger color would dominate the artwork much more. And I find that customers with more conservative tastes, or customers that are trying to consider decor and where the picture's going to go, they often feel more comfortable with neutral colored top mounts. When framers are deciding on a design, it seems to me that a lot of framers start off by deciding on mount choice and then choosing, excuse me, choosing a frame to match both the artwork and the mount. And I certainly find that this, from the artwork outwards approach, is the way that I like to work. It's in my opinion, the most logical way to work. However, I'm always going to make an exception when a molding choice is really obvious. For example, when the texture or the color pattern of a molding matches the artwork so well that it's hard for me to consider any other option. And this Peter Redding watercolor is a really good example of that. Now, you'll notice the mounts are fairly standard double mounts. In this case, it's worth noting that there's only a small amount, about 3 millimeters of that stronger bottom blue mount showing. But what I really like about this piece is how the molding matches the center rock in both color and its texture. To me, it looks like the molding was made for the picture. And I felt that to such an extent that on this particular piece, I did work backwards. I chose the mount to match the artwork and the molding rather than the other way around. Of course, sometimes a piece of artwork or an object comes in and it provides us with loads and loads of color options. I don't know about you, but I find that sometimes in my desire to get a design exactly right, I get carried away. And I end up with loads of different colored mount chevrons matching every possible color in the picture. And I end up realistically being overwhelmed. I find in that situation, what I try to do is discipline myself and to eliminate options by getting rid of any colors that aren't an exact match, or any colors that aren't balanced throughout the artwork. And of course, it's fair to say that the use of a number of different colored mounts can, of course, provide that balance by highlighting different colors in different parts of the artwork. Now, when I was trying to decide upon a design for this particular abstract, I pulled out mount chevrons to match all the colors in the artwork. And I ended up with mount chevrons piled all over my desk and just thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do here? You know, what are my options? And of course, this is always in front of a customer. I had lots of color options, but with most of the stronger colors being in the bottom left of the image, it was really hard with this particular piece to find a balance. The white, the black, and the gold are the most consistent colors of the image. Probably more so actually than you can see in the picture on the screen. The golds really stood out. I tried the white didn't work at all. And I was framing the piece to conservation level. And what that meant is that I didn't have the option of using a gold bottom mount unless I hand painted one. So I opted for a simple black mount, and I emphasized the gold by gluing a confetti range mount slip to the rebate of my plain black molding. And the point that I'm trying to make is I think that many framers fall into the mindset of thinking that they need to find the majority of their color matches with mounts. But we can use a neutral mount and we can emphasize the artwork's colors using the moldings instead. So why is it then that double mounts are a standard framing design format, but double moldings or stacking moldings isn't? I suppose one reason is that it's easier and it's cheaper to produce a double mount than to stack moldings. And many framers live under the false impression that lots of potential customers can't afford to pay much for their framing. I'm sure there are a few people listening today that would disagree with that. Certainly hope so. I've also heard it suggested that the stronger colors in a mount or frame design should be placed closer to the image, and that when you place them further out, it distracts the eye. So this would suggest then that matching the artwork's colors with the moldings rather than the mounts is a bad idea. Now here's a simple example of a double frame or stack moldings. The artwork's been float mounted on a blue board, which matches the background of the image and accentuates the deckled edges of the paper. The outer blue frame matches the mount and the inner orange emphasizes the central figure. But if we consider it for a moment, the colors and the proportions that are used are similar to those of a double mount. And what I mean by that is you've got a wider, more passive top color and a narrower, brighter bottom color. But in this case, the use of stacked moldings has made this design different. And it stands out far more than a single moulding and a double mount would. Here's another example. Only this time, we've got the same double frame concept on a canvas. The black burnt wood frame with its silvery grey highlights and silvery grey bevel has been selected to match that dry, arid feel of the foreground. Okay, it's actually a sort of burnt charcoal frame as well. And of course, the orange inner frame, or in this case, looking at it, it may again be a mount slip glued to the rebate. I quite like doing that. The orange inner frame hopefully complements the central point of the image. So what do you think after seeing those last two pieces? Is matching the colours of the artwork using the mouldings rather than the mount a bad idea? Again, let us know. Let us know your thoughts and what you think. You certainly aren't going to find many colours that are more likely to distract from the artwork than the last two inner orange mouldings that have been used. Now, one area I don't see a great deal of experimentation with in framing is depth. And again, perhaps it's because a lot of mouldings have shallow rebates, particularly at the lower priced end of the market. And those shallow rebates barely hold a single mount package, glazing a backboard, let alone the extra layers of foam board that are needed for a shadow mount. I have to say that these days, when I'm selecting my mouldings from my suppliers, from my rep, or I'm going through my Larson-Juhl brochure, what I do is I rule out mouldings that are too shallow. And I choose instead mouldings with deep rebates that allow me a far wider range of design options when I go to use those mouldings. Now, this design on the side incorporates a shadow mount to space the metals away from the glazing, but it's also got an additional shadow mount so that all the framed objects are set back. For me, the position of the apertures, their varying depths, and you combine that with the consistency of the double mount, or the double mounts rather, to me it creates a balance which draws my eye to each of the four elements. Now, I can be critical and say that I think that the double mount that I've used around the outside of the piece is possibly a little bit narrow, it's possibly a little bit too close to the width of the frame, but it's a piece that I'm generally very happy with. And I like the way that it's introduced that perspective. Now, talking of depth, Greg Perkins, who I've mentioned a number of times, he comments that the use of spacers is a necessity when framing something that's dimensional, but spacers are rarely used when framing a print or a photo. He also says that visually spacers can add depth or enhance the perspective of the artwork. And again, if we look at the piece on the right-hand side, I think it's a really great example of adding perspective. Greg's floated the artwork onto a pink board, a few millimeters of which is showing around the edge of the image. And then he's spaced that away from the undermount, I'm guessing probably using a 5mm foam board, and he's created a shadow effect with that. But to enhance the perspective in the piece and draw the viewer's eye towards the image, his double mount is then set higher again. And I'm guessing he's used either a 10mm foam board or up to 15mm foam board to create that double shadow effect, which really draws your eye into the picture and creates that perspective. Now, we've already talked about double mouldings or stacking mouldings. And one of the other reasons that I'm a big fan of that technique is because of the step depth that it offers. I think it draws the eye into the picture, or the frame draws the eye into the picture, much more so than if a single moulding had been used. So in this piece on the right-hand side, what I've done is I've used two profiles rather, of the same range, okay? One's got a bevel profile, the other was much flatter, the second inner moulding. And I think the bevel of the first adds to that effect of drawing the viewer's eye into the image. The second piece consists of the same color, size, and profile moulding stacked on top of itself. So the effect of depth is not quite so dramatic, but what would have been essentially a very plain and simple molding now has two added elements. It's got an added element of interest through that step. And the other thing that it's got is it's got added width. And I really think that on when we're framing things without mounts, when we're framing, therefore, sort of canvases, oils on board, etc., that we need to add width to the frame to give the frame some presence. I've never felt comfortable, never been a fan of very narrow frames around this sort of style of artwork. So I'm always looking at ways I can add width and other options apart from just, you know, the wider frames that I hold. Now, framers often talk about balance, and how we achieve balance in a design is a really hard thing to define. In an art and framing article in 2019, GCF David Wilkie, who has won numerous framing awards, said that balance encompasses the main components of the framing design. The frame and the mount all working together without any one part overwhelming the other or the artwork. And he goes on to say that all the components should be focused around the central point and the viewer's eye should be drawn towards that point. In the same article, David also talks about the weight of colours, saying that he thinks of a white mount as light and a stronger colour as heavy. So he considers, therefore, a wide cream mount to have the same weight as a narrow black mount. And of course, the point that David's making, in my opinion, is that each aspect of a frame design has to be balanced, both in relation to the artwork and in relation to every other aspect of the design. So, for example, the color weight of the artwork needs to be balanced by the color weight of the mount and the frame, and they need to work together to focus the viewer's eye on that central point. Now, I think this set of medals, this photograph and text box, are a good example. The brightness of the polished medals and the color of their ribbons make them a very strong element. And they're an element that could easily detract from the photograph, even though the photograph itself is actually relatively strong. And I think likewise, they could both detract from the text, and the text could quite easily be lost against those two pieces, against the strength of the medals and the photograph. And there's quite a lot of text there. The area of text box takes up as much of the area as photograph. So if you ended up with an unbalanced piece, I think it could end up looking quite strange. However, the use of the subtle grey mounts complements the photograph and it highlights the medals, but it doesn't overwhelm the text box. To me, though, it's the moulding that restores the balance completely. It matches the colours and the tone of the photograph and helps the photograph to hold its own against that brightness and that shine of the medals. Now let's finish off with something a little bit simpler and more straightforward. Single mounts. Sometimes a simple single mount is the most appropriate option. For example, when you're trying to achieve some balance in a design that's using complex molding design. Or sometimes it's just because that's what the customer's insisted upon. I think little details like the use of a thicker mount board or a V-groove, a centimetre or so in from the bevel edge, can add interest and a professional touch and something that's just a little bit different without detracting from the simplicity of the single mount. And in this photograph there is, I promise you, about 1.5 centimetres in from the bevel edge, there is a little V-groove. So to conclude, I think it's fair to say that there are lots and lots of aspects of frame design that can be explored. And even if I had 3 times the amount of time that I have here, we'd only really skim the surface. What we've seen, hopefully, is that many of the commonly thought of rules of framing design are only truly relevant to specific situations. We've also examined rules and guidelines that do hold true on the face of things. For example, that we should design with mount and frame colours that are as close as possible to the colours of the artwork or neutral colours. But even these vague and fairly general rules have possible exceptions. Now, how convinced you are regarding the mount and the moulding colours that are in direct contrast to the artwork remains to be seen. I'm sure that your comments will. I'll hear your comments in a minute. Now, of course, there are some rules that I haven't even touched upon. I won't argue, for instance, that you shouldn't use a mount color on its own that only emphasizes one part of the image when there are other just as important parts, for example, in a photograph of a group of people. But again, I'm using a very specific example, and that is exactly the point. The scenarios are endless, and what you should or shouldn't do depends completely on the individual object or piece of artwork. As soon as you introduce a new aspect of the design, all the rules change, and they change because the size and the color and the texture of that new component affects all the other components. So balance, proportion, contrast, and repetition are all relevant to one another and are only achieved by the right combination of elements. You add to that the need to draw the viewer's eye towards the artwork, and perhaps also some sort of hierarchy of the items within the frame. And the recipe for design success has got to be different each and every time. So what I want you to do now is look at the rule that you wrote down at the start of the presentation. Now, I'm willing to bet that it's either very general or very specific. And the chances are that whichever of those two it is, you can find some exceptions to that rule. In order to get the recipe for design right, we need to provide ourselves with the right tools. It's really important to me to have a constant source of sort of fresh input and fresh ideas. And despite what I said earlier, hidden amongst all the dross on social media, there is a wealth of information. You know, my own ideas regarding the use of stronger mount colors, or those colors that don't quite match, and spacing them away from the artwork to make them match, to make them work rather than match, or using small amounts of them. You know, those ideas have been reinforced by other framers' posts on social media. Framing books, I have framing books that are 35 years old, and they still provide me with new ideas and inspiration. And also, let's not forget framing magazines. To me, one of the jobs of our framing magazines is to land on our doorstep, you know, every couple of months, or if we, you know, look at them digitally, and to provide me with new inspiration, new ideas. Finally, I hope that all framers make time to play, to try out different ideas with mount and frame colors, and different ideas with textures and proportions and depths, to see how the different ideas look. And I think it's really important to do that, and to be willing also to sort of copy and emulate other framers' design concepts, to try things and say, well, that works for me, that doesn't work for me, I like this, I like it when I take that design concept and I change it a little bit. And I call it making time to play because, or I say making time rather, because it's not something that you can do in front of a customer. You know, you can't take a customer's artwork if you haven't sort of practiced these techniques and try and do something really, really different with it, because you need to be free to make mistakes and to get things wrong. Now, of course, in other industries, they call this playing research and development. And it's vital to the continued growth of new products and new ideas. So, questions?
Thanks, John. Do you want to?
No problem, Matt. Yeah. So, it seemed to me that, well, sorry, Matt, I'm losing you there slightly.
Just stop sharing your screen, and then we'll suggest that we can come up, dig onto the screen. Perfect. So, great. Listen, thanks very much. I think it's really interesting to get everybody thinking, and we'll run through a few of the questions that we've got in a minute. And I guess, you know, for me, being relatively new into the industry as well, and there'll be lots of people who are on the webinar who've got lots of experience. The interesting thing for me is almost the challenging of some of the traditional kind of rules or normal, which I think is very interesting. whether that's, it is subjective at the end of the day, and whether that is around color, the contrasting of the colors, whether that's double mounting, single mounting, depth, balance. I guess, the interesting thing from me is to, different opinions and being able to challenge those normals. So let's.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, I think that was that was the hardest thing to sit down and to write this. When we came up with the concept of doing something on frame design, and again, you can follow the general path that has been followed before, and you can say, okay, I'll write some specific rules that only apply to this situation, or general rules that probably apply to most situations, but not all. And you can do that, but actually to try and really come up with a definitive list of rules is really hard. And the reason is because everybody's opinion is different. I don't think there are necessarily any right or wrongs, but I think the point that I'm really trying to make with the article is that actually what we need to do is we need to be thinking about it, and we need to challenge ourselves, and we need to be experimenting all the time and finding things, like those. I wouldn't even thought that contrasting colors on a frame to the artwork would work at all in any way, shape or form. And then I'm sitting there looking at those ideas thinking, hold on, actually I quite like this. And I can imagine some of my customers quite liking this. I'm sure that there are framers out there listening now that are banging their heads against the table saying, what?
We'll come on to a few of the comments in a minute. So, but Justin's just said on here, a lot to mull over. Justin's put on there, and he's put that he highly recommends Greg Perkins' book, Guidelines for Great Frame Design. So, listen, I think, John, probably the easy thing to do would be to go down the traditional rule book. And that's kind of the easy thing to do, isn't it, really, to relate back to probably the traditional theories and then stick to some of those. But I think it's all part of it is making all of us, whether you're new to framing or very experienced at framing, try and think of a different lens on it. And yeah, some people will agree with you. Some will strongly agree with you. Some will strongly disagree with you. Others will be somewhere in the middle. But
and that's definitely the way it should be. Listen, it's very important that you don't ask too many questions because the surf's very good today. So please. Fire away.
Let's just go through, because some of them are questions and some of them are comments, really just around observations as we went through the different things of when you was asking for different questions. But I got a bit on chat first of all that Joe was just saying, excellent, John, thank you, lots of inspiration and food for thought. So thank you, Joe. So thank you, Joe, for attending. Stephen's just put, I do think it's the opposite to Tuesday's trends idea, which is probably quite an interesting thought around Alice's idea on trends on Tuesday, when she was thinking about the different colours and some of the trends around sustainability or the bright colours relating to the NHS and some of those things. So
it's really funny. Oh, sorry, Matt. It's really funny that you say that. And I there was, when I first wrote this, there were this webinar, there were some ideas in there on trends and on fashions. Now, it's something that really interests me, because I think it's just being down here in North Cornwall. I don't really see my customers coming in and following specific trends, and and I hear a lot of people in the industry talking about interior design and trends and what's fashionable, and I can only ever once remember somebody coming in and saying, "Oh, I must have a copper frame because for my kitchen, and copper's really in this year." And that just doesn't happen to me. So it's very interesting you say that. And I didn't see all of Tuesday's presentation, so I'm going to go back and look over it again.
I think there could definitely be some regional bias in that as well. Somebody who's in North Cornwall and maybe a bit more relaxed pace of life to somebody who's in the city in the centre of London. And
absolutely,
whether it's personally or regionally or where you are, there's definitely going to be some regional variance and personal.
In fact, just in sorry, I was going to say, just in that Justin's posted that he agrees. He's I think he's fairly out there in the country like I am, and he just doesn't have the same kind of questions about trends and design styles.
So, it isn't one size fits all, and that was part of why we wanted to do these webinars, to just get people thinking a bit. I think Maxwell, it's a good comment from Maxwell as well. It's improvising on the rules, and a golfer doesn't alter his swing by feet, it's fractions of an inch. That's a really fair comment as well. And I think, we want to just, there's some things that you might just take the odd thing from this that makes you think a little bit about what you're doing, then that's great, really.
Absolutely.
While we're trying to do it. I think I've covered some of the chat already. Let's just go through a few of the Q&A ones. I'm going to refer just back here to some of the things that we went through. I'll give a few opinions. So Alistair was just saying that it doesn't work for me, and more to the point, who would have it in their house?
I assume this was with regard to which particular piece?
I think that was the rose we were talking
about.
about.
Okay.
So,
I won't wrap it up and send it to him then.
Mark's just put, in my view, contrasting colours work, but it is subjective, and those who are less confident in colour confident will not go for it.
Absolutely.
Fair. And Stephen, thanks, Stephen. Just generally with contrasting colours, a third colour is normally used in a small way. So a third colour in that rose might have, in between the purple and yellow, might work. So the Fanta is the white in there. And I think from my background in, I worked for Coca-Cola, and Fanta was one of the brands in marketing. Then those a third colour to tone down the contrast sometimes does help. That's probably a good point. Maxwell's just put, in my opinion, it don't think it works here, but it's very much dependent on the artwork. So it can work if the artwork lends itself to contrast.
Yeah. It wasn't. I have to admit, that wasn't a design that I particularly. I didn't look at that and think, wow, this is amazing. This is something that I would do. But my intent was to sort of provoke a little bit of a response. But it was interesting how it grew on me. After I'd been sitting and looking at it for a number of days, how I thought, well, actually, I don't mind that so much. As I say, maybe I just sat in front of the computer for too long.
Yeah, you can get like that. Yeah, Mark's just talked about the silver birch tree, that he wouldn't go for strong blue mount in the silver birch tree. It pulls you away from the picture's character. So, but I'd have slept on it, he said. So, but again, it is interesting because you could do, and then you could, over a period of time, get to a different answer.
Yeah, I mean, and that particular piece, the client absolutely loved it. It was a collector, and I framed a number of Peter Redding pieces for that particular client, and they really liked quite strong, vibrant framing, which was fun. But yeah, of course, everybody's opinion is different, and that's one of the. It would be really boring if we all agreed.
Yeah, way too easy.
Yeah, absolutely, and not to me, it would lose a lot of its interest and its challenge.
It's part of the enjoyment of the industry, isn't it, and the creative.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Guy, that customers sometimes have very fixed ideas on keeping the artwork bland. Do you discuss room settings and colours when consulting on what best works, or is it always about enhancing the artwork?
Now, in my opinion, it's always about the artwork, but I wouldn't say that to my customers. Yeah, I do. I always ask the question about whether they have any particular ideas about what they want to do with the piece. I always ask them whether they're considering the setting. But I think it's a secondary thing. And if they have very fixed ideas, which some people do, then I don't think they're really using the services of the bespoke framer as well as they could do, because if they were an expert in design, framing design, they'd be framing it themselves. And so what I do, of course, you can't be challenging with a customer like that. What I do is I present them with their idea and then say, look, do you mind if I show you some other suggestions, just so I ensure that you're getting value for money? And I show them other design options. And I would say the majority of the time, people say, oh, no, I really like that. Yeah. And you even get people that say, oh, I feel silly now having suggested an idea. So I think diplomatically, you can show people other ideas and suggestions, and some will go back to what they wanted in the first place, no matter how bad it looks. And others will, will be swayed by your ideas and your opinions if you suggest it to them in the right way.
Yeah, I guess that picks up on some of the things we discussed in the first set of webinars around, you being there to influence the customer, but they have to come with you as well, don't they? So that's what you're there for.
No, absolutely. And I was quite conscious not to cross over too much with the stuff that Joe had done in the last set of webinars, because of course there is crossover in this, and the way that you speak to your customers and the way that you take on their ideas and talk about settings and things like that. I wanted this purely to be about something that was quite interesting frame design wise and got people thinking.
Okay. Cool. Just a few more sort of comments on some of the ones that we've been through. Stephen was just saying about the orange one. I see the inner orange of the frame more than the art in this instance. That must have been
Okay. Yes. Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
It is quite strong. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's yeah. I'm interested in what people think, particularly about that, and the use of frames and stacking moldings and pulling out the colours from the artwork in that way.
Very vivid images like the abstract are so vibrant that I think the artwork should be allowed to speak for itself.
Yes.
Love the double mouldings. Got from Mark. Stephen mentioned about the difference again to Tuesday's approach, which is probably a fair comment. And then just from Maxwell at the end, just saying that we all have rules. They're logged in our head and it's experience, which I think is absolutely fair. There's a lot of you out there with lots of experience. So many variables in framing that we have to be prepared to use 100 rules for every framing job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different things you're thinking about.
I think you do. I think you do have those rules in your head and you decide that certain things work. But I think also that it's important to challenge yourself and to challenge those rules sometimes, because as I say, every frame's different. And I think that most of the rules that I have had, I will have then broken at some point. And it's quite nice to do that. It's quite fun to do that.
Yeah, and it comes on to your point at the end. And then Maxwell's put as well that, what the customer wants to live with is also important. I think, you mentioned that as well, didn't you? It is their home. And the most obvious frame for the job may well not go with the customer's home.
Yeah, absolutely.
May come on to just some of the questioning at the start to which is just natural and part of the process that you go through of establishing where it is and what it's blending in with, all the different the different things in the surrounding of the artwork is important, isn't it?
I think there's a lot to be said as well for getting to know your customers. I mean, again, Joe touched on this. I think when you've got a regular customer, or when you've framed a couple of pieces for a customer, you start to get an idea of the sort of stuff that they like and whether it's very conservative, their tastes, or whether they want to go for something that's a little bit kind of more interesting. And I think when it's a new customer, you start to get that feel quite quickly by reading body language and reading responses, and you can see that you can put down different options and get no response, and as soon as you put something down, you can just see somebody lights up and responds to that. So it's that touches on the stuff that Joe was talking about with regard to sort of body language and the way you interact with your customers.
Yeah, and Max was also just added that another question I ask the customer when they choose a combination is, what's the first thing that they see? Is it the mount or the frame? If it's the mount. So he said another question I ask the customer when they choose a combination of moulding or mount is, what's the first thing that you see when you're looking at it? Are you seeing the mount? Right. Are you seeing the frame? And if it's the mount, then it might not work. So that's quite an interesting way if they're drawn immediately to the mount rather than the frame.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of framers would answer that the first thing the person should see is the artwork. And again, to be a little bit provocative about it, I've read that comment a number of times that if the frame is noticeable, it's wrong. But I kind of want my framing to be noticeable. I of course I don't want to detract from the artwork, but at the same time, I think that I want framing that's noticeable and that people will comment on the framing hopefully in a positive way if they're customers or potential customers.
And then just a final one, just with the latest technology, iPhone videos, would it help when designing a piece if they bring in a video of the room setting, helping with the size and the colour?
I can see advantages and disadvantages. I mean, I think it might. I don't want to sound too cynical when I say this, but I think that when you talk to your customers, the more information you can get from them, the better. Even if, and not in this particular case, even if some of that information is superfluous, because it's helping you to build rapport with your customer and to talk to them about the piece and get a feel for how important that particular piece is to them. So yes, I think it has those advantages. I would say on the negative side that I think whenever you're looking at something on a phone or even on a computer, that the colors can be quite different to the colors in reality. So I'm not sure how it would work in those circumstances, yes, it would give you a feel, sure.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thanks a lot. I think we are through the questions and the chat. So yeah, listen, thanks to you, John. I think it's been a really good session. Thank you to everybody who's joined live. And also thank you to everybody who is going to be watching after the event, because one of the reasons that we did actually let everybody know that we're recording the webinars and then putting them on the website afterwards is that there was a lot of feedback that I got, first of all, that it can be difficult, and even more so now that everybody's starting to think about getting back to business, to actually watch and schedule live. And you know, I can't always please everybody with the timing being good for everybody. So I know that there's going to be lots of people who will be watching this not live and checking into this afterwards. So I'd also like to just thank you for watching as well. So yes, that's enough thank yous now. I'll let you get back to the surf.
Great, thank you everybody, and yeah, lovely. Thank you, Matt. I'll let you know how the surf was.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, thanks, John. Thanks,
okay,
everybody.
thanks. Bye bye, everybody.